One of the most intriguing aspects of studying the Torah are the numerous stories where people are punished for doing something inappropriate, but what exactly the indiscretion was is not actually very clear. I'll give a few examples. In the very beginning of the book of Genesis, we know that Cain and Abel, the children of Adam and Eve, they bring offerings to God. And we're told that the offering of Cain was rejected. But it's not so obvious why. In chapter 11 of Genesis, people gather together to build a huge tower, and this is very displeasing to God. And so he sabotages their project by confusing their languages and disrupting their ability to communicate with each other. But what was so terrible about what they were doing? It's not that clear in the Torah. A third example. Next week, the program that we'll be having here, we're going to be discussing an incredibly perplexing story in the 4th chapter of the book of Exodus, where Moses was on his way from Midian back to Egypt to carry out the mission God gave him to confront Pharaoh and demand, "Let my people go," that Pharaoh should free the Israelites from their slavery. And out of the blue, the Torah tells us that God sought to kill Moses. This is certainly extremely mysterious. In the 20th chapter of the book of Numbers, the Israelites are upset because they don't have any water to drink. So God tells Moses to take his staff, to approach a large rock, and to speak to the rock that it should release its water. Moses strikes the rock, water gushes out, and the people and their livestock drink. But God is very upset with Moses and with his brother Aaron, and says that now neither of them will be allowed to go into the promised land. It's hard to understand what crime Moses committed, and impossible to comprehend what Aaron did that was so wrong. What warranted this incredibly severe punishment? Numerous theories are proposed by various commentaries, but the fact that there are a plethora of suggestions highlights the Torah's ambiguity. Similarly, the episode that we'll be discussing tonight, the tragic deaths of Aaron's sons Nadav and Avihu, is extremely perplexing. Let's first summarize the story and then consider why it is so hard to grasp. Leviticus chapter 9 follows the longest buildup of any story in the Torah. After the miraculous exodus from Egypt and the destruction of Pharaoh's army at the Sea of Reeds, the children of Israel arrived at Mount Sinai. 7 weeks after their exodus from Egypt, the people experienced mass prophecy and heard God speak with the revelation of the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 utterances. And they waited for Moses to come down from the mountain with the engraved tablets, but they panicked when they thought he hadn't returned on time. And this panic led them to the debacle of the golden calf. When soon afterward Moses came down and saw the dancing around this idol, he smashed the stone tablets. God was furious with the people and was going to destroy the entire nation and start all over again with Moses. But Moses interceded with 40 days of intense prayer and bought them some time. And after another 40 days of prayer up at Mount Sinai, Moses was able to effect some kind of reconciliation, and he came down with the second set of tablets that he carved on the 10th day of Tishrei, which would become Yom Kippur, our Day of Atonement. The people were not going to be destroyed, but their relationship with God was far from cozy. How would the people know that their relationship with God was restored and God would be willing to have his Shekhinah, his divine presence, dwell within the midst of the people once again? After God sent Moses back to the people with the second set of tablets to signal that they were at least pardoned, he instructed the nation to construct a tabernacle where his presence would dwell. So he says in Exodus chapter 25, verse 8, Ve'asu li mikdash ve'shochanti betocham. They shall make for me a sanctuary so that I may dwell among them. That's the goal. So from chapter 25 in the book of Exodus until the very end of the book in chapter 40, 15 chapters, the Torah describes the elaborate instructions for constructing the tabernacle, its vessels, its special priestly garments, and how the Israelites faithfully and carefully followed all of these instructions. And by the end of the book of Exodus, everything is constructed and ready for operation. The third book of the Torah, the book of Leviticus, begins with 8 chapters of instructions detailing the various sacrificial offerings that will be brought in the tabernacle. And by chapter 9, so think about this, we've had 15 chapters towards the end of the book of Exodus dealing with the operation of this tabernacle, and then 8 chapters in the book of Leviticus explaining everything that's going to be going on there and all the offerings and sacrifices. So by the beginning of chapter 9, everything is now ready. For 7 days, the tabernacle is going to be inaugurated, and Aaron and his 4 sons, Nadav and Avihu, and Eleazar and Itamar, are going to be consecrated during these 7 days into office. For this entire week, they were secluded in the tabernacle, and under the direction of Moses, they prepared themselves in anticipation of the dramatic moment when they would actually begin serving in this temple, in this tabernacle. The 8th day would be the climax of all that came before, when God's presence would appear finally, and the people would know that their relationship with God was restored. Indeed, a heavenly fire went forth from God and lit the tabernacle's altar. This heavenly fire remained burning on the altar for 889 years, until the destruction of the first holy temple. But just at this very moment of great jubilation, tragedy strikes. Aaron's 2 eldest sons, Nadav and Avihu, took their censers, put fire into them, and added incense. They offered an unauthorized fire before God that they had not been commanded to offer. Fire came forth from before God, possibly the very heavenly fire that had been sent to ignite the altar, and this fire consumed Nadav and Avihu, who died before the Lord. Celebration turned to disaster, and we're left with one of the most mystifying episodes in the entire Torah. Let's outline some of the reasons that this story is so puzzling. First of all, one of the complicating factors in this tragedy is that we know that Nadav and Avihu were considered extremely great men on a very, very high level. First of all, we see that the order of those who went up towards God at Mount Sinai were first Moses and Aaron, and then Nadav and Avihu, and finally the 70 elders of Israel. So you see that right after Moses and Aaron, the next two are Nadav and Avihu. They're obviously not slouches. Secondly, right after the death of Nadav and Avihu, Moses says to Aaron, imagine what a terrible tragedy this is for Aaron. He just lost his two eldest sons. And Moses says to him, this is what God was speaking about when he said, I will be sanctified by those who are closest to me, and before the entire nation I will be glorified. Now Rashi, on this verse, cites the Midrash, and he relates the rest of Moses' remarks to his brother Aaron. Moses says, Aaron, my brother, I knew that the sanctuary would be sanctified through the martyrdom of those closest to God. But I had thought it would be through me or through you. But now that it has occurred through Nadav and Avihu, I see that they are greater than you and I. Out of the mouth of Moses, and Moses would not exaggerate. He's not saying things, we know that at a funeral, for example, you're not allowed to exaggerate during the eulogies. What you say has to be accurate and true. Moses is not just assuaging the terrible grief of his brother Aaron. If he says it, he means it. He's saying to Aaron that I had thought that either you or I would sanctify the sanctuary through our martyrdom. Now that I see that it came through Nadav and Avihu, Moses says, I now see they are greater than both you and I. Now, if Nadav and Avihu were such great and holy people who were so close to God, why did they meet such a tragic end? And because this question is so mysterious, because it's not so clear what their crime was, rabbinic sages in various midrashim propose various possibilities for what the fault of Nadav and Avihu might have been. The great teacher of Musar, Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler, in his famous work Michtav Me'Eliyahu, summarizes many of these midrashic suggestions. I'll be sharing 10 of them. Imagine the rabbis had at least 10 theories for what Nadav and Avihu did that was so terrible. Number one, we're told, they decided a law in the presence of their teacher Moses. Students are not supposed to decide on their own a new law in the presence of their teacher. If there was something to be discussed, they should have consulted with Moses. They didn't. They themselves decided to bring the fire that they brought, and that was a problem. The second suggestion is they entered the Holy of Holies in the Tabernacle without permission. Normally, only the high priest, who was Aaron at that time, was allowed into the Holy of Holies, and only very, very, very rarely, for example, on Yom Kippur. Number three, they brought an offering they were not commanded to bring. There was no commandment to bring this incense that they were bringing into the temple. Number four, they brought fire from their own source, meaning that God had sent fire from heaven that ignited the altar, and instead of using that fire, they brought their own fire from their own source. Number 5, they acted independently of each other without consulting the other brother. Number 6, they entered the tabernacle after drinking wine. They had drunk wine before coming in to do their service. Number 7, they entered the tabernacle without wearing the proper garments, their special priestly garments, and they didn't have all of them on that they needed to have. Number 8, they never got married. And the Midrash says, why didn't they get married? Because they felt, look, our father is Aaron the high priest, our uncle Moses is basically the king of the Jews. No one is good enough for us. That's how they felt. And because they didn't get married, the Midrash says, that's why they were immolated on this day. Number 9, Nadav and Avihu were walking behind. Imagine this. They're walking behind Moses and Aaron, and Nadav says to his brother Avihu, when these 2 elders die, you and I will lead this generation. And God said in the Midrash, let's see who will bury who. The 10th reason that is suggested by Rabbi Dessler, again, he didn't make these up, these are from the Midrash. In Exodus chapter 24, Nadav and Avihu feasted their eyes on the glory of the divine presence, on the glory of the Shekhinah, which they beheld at Mount Sinai. God had told Moses at that time that he and Aaron and Nadav and Avihu and the 70 elders of Israel should ascend the mountain towards the presence of God, and that they should prostrate themselves from afar. That was God's instructions. Come up towards me at Mount Sinai and prostrate yourselves from afar. But they didn't do that, Nadav and Avihu. They couldn't take their eyes off of the divine presence, staring, if you will. And the Midrash contrasts the behavior of Nadav and Avihu to the behavior of Moses at the burning bush. The Midrash says it is good that Moses hid his face. When Moses sees the divine presence in that burning bush, Moses hid his face. The Holy One, blessed be he, said, I wanted to reveal myself to you, and you honored me by covering your face. I swear that when you will be with me on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights without food or drink, you will take pleasure in the radiance of the Shekhinah, in the radiance of the divine presence. As it says, Moses did not know that his face glowed. When he came down from Mount Sinai, his face was glowing, which was basically a reflection of the divine presence that he had encountered. He wasn't aware of it. But the Midrash says, but Nadav and Avihu uncovered their faces and filled their eyes with the radiance of the Shekhinah, of the divine presence, as it says to the aristocracy of the children of Israel, he did not strike his hand. They viewed the Lord, and they ate and they drank. But they were not punished for what they did. Why didn't God punish them at Mount Sinai? They deserved to be punished. So the Midrash says they did not get punished at Mount Sinai because God did not want to disturb the joy of the occasion of the giving of the Torah. But that raises another question. Because the day of the consecration of the tabernacle was also supposed to be a joyous day. So why did God kill Nadav and Avihu on that day? And of course, why would our sages come up with all of these possible indiscretions that are not explicitly in the Torah? The Torah doesn't mention really almost any of these 10 that are suggested, when the cause of their deaths seems to be plainly stated in the Torah. when you read the Torah says they brought a strange fire that they were not commanded to bring. And then God had a fire consume them. So the text seems to be saying something. So why invent all of these other reasons? And the questions proliferate. Because granted that they brought this fire on their own initiative, even though they weren't commanded to do so, but does that warrant such a drastic punishment? Their intention was to do something positive, to serve God, to worship God. So they weren't commanded to do it. They did it on their own, a free will offering. Does that deserve to be punished so severely? And if our sages had such an elevated view of Nadav and Avihu, of their spiritual level, we're told they're higher than Moses and Aaron, why do they, the sages, at the same time, suggest so many sins that they were guilty of? These are some questions that come up. And there are many, many other questions. But let's try to address a few of these. Rabbi Zev Leff, currently living in Israel, originally from the United States, in his discussion of this episode, he quotes a midrash where Moses said to the Jewish people, "Remove the Yetzer Hara, remove the evil inclination from your hearts, so that you will be inspired with a common awe and common service of God. As He is one," meaning as God is one, "so should your service of Him be one." This is the Midrash. And according to Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Berlin, at the time of Moses already, there were people who wanted to experience spiritual ecstasy and draw close to God through means not prescribed by the Torah. Moses was urging the people here to desist from this prompting of the evil inclination. Any path to God not delineated in the Torah does not stem from a healthy impulse. Our sages taught that when our spiritual path is driven by our own emotions and enthusiasm alone, meaning when what moves us is exclusively our own desires and our own emotions and our own enthusiasm, each person is going to create their own path to God. And their service will be fragmented into many different approaches. However, this is a contradiction of the Almighty's unity. God is one. God is a unity. Therefore, our paths, our spiritual paths to God, must be defined by the Torah, so that the community will have a unity of expression that reflects the unity of God. Our service of God needs to be a combination of fervor, obviously, with a careful following of the guidelines set out by God for how we are supposed to relate to Him. When we ignore these guidelines and pursue pathways to God based on our own subjective feelings and ideas, this is a dangerous return to what happened at the time of the golden calf. The golden calf was a disastrous plan to get close to God using an approach that was not permitted by the Torah. The main feature that allowed the tabernacle to be a place where God's presence could dwell when you think about it, what was so special about the tabernacle? It was that it was made exactly according to God's instructions. When you read through all those chapters describing how they constructed the tabernacle, the phrase, as God commanded Moses, that phrase, as God commanded Moses, is repeated over and over and over again. That is the essence of this tabernacle. It wasn't something that the people themselves came up with. They were following God's precise instructions precisely. And we are told that the people followed God's instructions to a T. So even though Nadav and Avihu were great people, but they were driven by an impulse to serve God according to the path that they devised, and not by dutifully following God's instructions. Like Frank Sinatra, they chose to do it my way. We first saw this tendency at Mount Sinai, when the ecstatic desires of Nadav and Avihu and their inspiration in the presence of God was not tempered by appropriate restraint. We saw what happened to them up at Mount Sinai. They got so carried away with being in the presence of God and beholding the Shekhinah, beholding the divine presence, they got carried away and they didn't put on the brakes. They chose to stare, if you will. Now, God hoped that receiving the Torah would correct this inclination of theirs. Of course, this story of them at Mount Sinai is prior to the Torah being given. God didn't kill them, as we're told, because God didn't want to ruin the joyous atmosphere of the receiving of the Torah. And God was hoping that the Torah would help correct this tendency of Nadav and Avihu to go their own way. However, on the day when the tabernacle was inaugurated, that day was the foundation of all future service of God. Think about it. You know, the moment a rocket ship takes off, that's a very crucial moment. Because if that rocket ship is not positioned properly, if it is a millionth of a degree off of where it should be pointed, after a few months, it's going to be very, very far away from where it was supposed to go. The beginning of any project is critical. If at the beginning of the career of a fetus there's a problem with that zygote, its DNA, something in the mother's womb, it's going to destroy that infant. So this day when the tabernacle was finally being inaugurated and they were serving there for the first time, this was laying the foundation for all future service of God. Unfortunately, the actions of Nadav and Avihu revealed that the corrective of the Torah didn't impact them. What God was hoping for, that the Torah that was given at Mount Sinai would somehow rein in the impulses of Nadav and Avihu, it didn't really work. It didn't impact them enough. And in their zeal to draw close to God, they brought a strange fire, one that was not prescribed by God. And because this was the first day of divine service in the tabernacle, God determined that there had to be a clear demonstration of the danger of serving the divine based on solely one's personal emotions and one's personal inspiration detached from the Torah's guidelines. So the deaths of Nadav and Avihu were meant to send a much-needed message for all time, that our service of God can't be have it your way and based on personal emotion and enthusiasm alone. Rather, It must carefully follow the instructions given by God. Now, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory, the former chief rabbi of the British Commonwealth, took this idea a little bit deeper. He explained that the tabernacle was a sanctuary of holiness. Holiness was the key of the sanctuary, where God's presence is manifest. And Rabbi Sacks invoked the Kabbalistic idea of tzimtzum, of self-restriction, to explain God's relationship with humanity. In order to create a place for human beings in the world, and in order to allow human beings to function as beings with free will, without being overwhelmed by the presence of God, the Almighty contracted his immanence and diminished his presence in the world. He restricted his presence in the world. This is similar, Rabbi Sacks said, to a parent who steps back from their children and lets go from intervening in their lives in order to allow their children to individuate and to grow and to mature. We see parents that are too involved with their children suffocate their children, smother them. The children can't develop and can't grow. So God, as it were, steps back from the world, restricts himself to allow human beings to function as free-willed human beings. But the Almighty does not withdraw entirely, and he does not abandon the world. The realm of the holy is where we encounter God, both in the realm of time, for example, the holiness of Shabbat, and in the realm of space, like in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. But creating these realms of holiness requires an act of tzimtzum, of self-constriction on the part of mankind. So again, in order to allow human beings to be fully human, God constricts himself. But in order for human beings to be able to encounter God, we need to constrict ourselves by self-limitation, where we relinquish our personal will and our personal strivings and the personal expressions of our egos. If we do that, we're able to experience the presence of God. God does value human initiative, and God has empowered us to use our personal strivings and initiative in order to work with God as covenantal partners in the development of creation. God does want us to assert ourselves, but there have to be times and places where we encounter and experience God, and these times require absolute obedience and a stepping back from our own will. The mistake of Nadav and Avihu was to assert their own ideas and their own initiative in the realm of the holy, when they needed to do the exact opposite. They asserted their own presence in the absolute presence of God, and that is why they died. Their I-ness should have been silenced in God's absolute presence, and that became their fate. Their I-ness was silenced. Now, I'd like to conclude tonight by sharing a novel approach to the story of Nadav and Avihu that was taught by Rabbi Tzvi Dov Kanatopsky. Rabbi Kanatopsky was a brilliant Torah scholar who lived in the 20th century and was taken from the world at far too young an age. Rabbi Kanatopsky focuses on the comments of some of the mystical sages, including the Ramban, Nachmanides, and Rabbeinu Bachya. And these sages maintain that Nadav and Avihu brought incense that was their offering, they brought incense with the intention of addressing God's attribute of justice, and they did not direct their attention to the attribute of mercy. Now, this is a pretty mystical idea. It's not so clear what these rabbis mean. What does it mean that they brought incense with the purpose of addressing only the attribute of God of justice, and they did not direct their attention to the attribute of mercy? This is what Rabbi Kanatopsky is going to unpack for us. Now, in order to understand these ideas, Rabbi Kanatopsky draws our attention to the larger context of the episode of Nadav and Avihu. So let's not only look at that little piece of where they do the wrong thing and they are killed, but Rabbi Kanatopsky says the story of Nadav and Avihu is part of a bigger story. And in order to really grasp what was going on with Nadav and Avihu, we have to see the bigger picture. So this story, the bigger story, takes place again on the 8th day after the tabernacle was inaugurated and the investiture of Aaron and his sons as priests. And on this 8th day, Aaron was supposed to begin his service in the sanctuary that again would cause the glory of God to appear. That was the ultimate goal. But when you read the story carefully, there seems to be a sense of urgency at one point, because it seems that the glory of God failed to materialize. Let's look at this. After performing the service and offerings and all of the prescribed sacrifices, Aaron raised his hands and blesses the people. So again, the Bible describes an immense amount of services and offerings and sacrifices that Aaron does. This was the program for this day in which the tabernacle was finally being put to use. And after the entire day's program, Aaron raises his hands and he blesses the people. But then the Torah says that Moses and Aaron went into the tent of meeting, and then they came out, and they blessed the people once again. Now, this part of the story is a little bit strange. Aaron had just blessed the people. So why do Moses and Aaron enter the tent of meeting, emerge from the tent of meeting, and then bless the people once again? What's that all about? So Rashi, the famous commentary of Rashi, explains that all of this frenzied activity, all of this urgency that you see from Aaron and Moses reflected the concern that Moses and Aaron had, that after all the sacrifices and offerings, and after blessing the people, there was no sign of the appearance of God's glory. It seemed like the whole day was a dud. And out of their concern, what did Moses and Aaron do? They felt the people must be crushed. Don't forget what was going on here. The people knew that after the golden calf, God wanted to destroy them. And thank God, Moses' prayers averted their destruction. But what about our relationship with God? Is God going to be close to us again? And all of these chapters, the construction of the tabernacle and in inaugurating and getting it ready, and finally the day in which it's going to be put to use. So the purpose of that whole day was that the glory of God should appear. And it didn't happen. So Moses and Aaron entered the tent of meeting to do what? It doesn't say in the Torah, but we know what they did. They went in to pray. And when they came out, they blessed the people again. If we understand what's going on here, Moses and Aaron are acting out of the feeling that something has to be done for the people. And so when they entered the tent of meeting, they appealed to God's attribute of mercy. That out of compassion for the people, God should respond to their prayers. And when they emerge after their prayers, and they bless the people again to calm their fears and assure them that God is going to be with them, there's no suggestion from Moses and Aaron that the people are responsible for the failure of God's glory to appear. There's no suggestion by Aaron and Moses at all. Actually, it is Aaron who takes this responsibility upon himself. Don't forget, who is it that constructed the golden calf? Aaron did it. He might have been forced to do it, but Aaron, we know in the Bible, felt guilty for this his entire life. So Aaron and Moses didn't blame the people for the failure of their sacrifices to bring the divine glory. Aaron takes responsibility upon himself. And they both appeal to God's mercy. God, have compassion and mercy on your people. And after Aaron blesses the people the second time, a heavenly fire went forth from the Almighty and consumed the burnt offering and the fats that were upon the altar. And we're told at the end of chapter 9 of Leviticus that the people saw this, and they sung songs of rejoicing, and they fell upon their faces. Touchdown. This was success. When we look at the actions of Nadav and Avihu in the context of this broader story now, their transgression becomes clearer. As we mentioned before, Nadav and Avihu are part of an earlier episode in the Torah that, according to the Midrash, is related to the story that we're studying here in Leviticus. That earlier story took place at the time when the Torah was about to be given at Mount Sinai. And in the book of Exodus, chapter 24, we're told that Moses and Aaron and Nadav and Avihu and the 70 elders of Israel went up towards Sinai, and the Torah says, and they saw the God of Israel, and under his feet, so to speak, was the making of a sapphire brick, and the very essence of the heavens in purity. The next verse tells us that the great men of Israel, and this is understood to be referring to Nadav and Avihu, they gazed at God and ate and drank, but God did not stretch out his hand against them. Again, we know why. God did not want to mar the festivity of this time of the giving of the Torah. So the Midrash says they would be punished later on. Namely, in this story that we're studying now in the book of Leviticus, at the consecration and inauguration of the Tabernacle. Now, in the commentary of Nachmanides, the Ramban, to this passage in Exodus, he says something amazing. Listen very carefully. Nachmanides says that what Nadav and Avihu saw in their vision at Mount Sinai, he says, was comparable to the vision that Ezekiel had in the first chapter of his book. In the book of the prophet Ezekiel, in the first chapter, Ezekiel has an incredible vision, a spiritual vision. Ezekiel as well saw the purity of the heavens. He saw something like a sapphire stone, and above it a chair, and above it a vision of God. This is an amazing parallel to what was seen by Nadav and Avihu. What Ezekiel saw was very similar to what was seen by Nadav and Avihu. They're parallel, but their visions are very different. If you pay careful attention, as I'll show you, they see the same things, but they see them from the opposite perspective. They're mirror images of each other. Again, Ezekiel sees the heavens first, then the sapphire above the heavens, and then the vision of God above the sapphire stone. However, in the book of Exodus, in the vision of Nadav and Avihu, they first have a vision of God, and then they see the sapphire brick. And under his feet they see the sapphire brick, and then they see the purity of the heavens. The difference is that Ezekiel seems to be looking up, and Nadav and Avihu seem to be looking down. Ezekiel is on the ground, looking up. So what does he see first? He sees the heavens first, then the sapphire, and then the vision of God. That's the vision of Ezekiel. But Nadav and Avihu seem to be looking down. So they see the vision of God first, and then the sapphire, and finally the heavens below. According to Rabbi Kanatopsky, what they are all viewing is the relationship between God and the history of Israel, which is often a very tragic history. Ezekiel views this history as a human being. Nadav and Avihu view it almost like angels from above. When Ezekiel looks upward, living himself in the midst of tragedy, he sees the heavens open and has a vision of God. And what does Ezekiel do? The end of chapter 1 in Ezekiel, he falls on his face in humility, and he prays for divine mercy and for God to temper his attribute of justice. However, Nadav and Avihu, viewing this experience of Jewish history from above, they see the absolute correctness of the attribute of justice. They understand the attribute of justice. They understand the suffering of Israel. They're getting what they deserve. That's what justice is. A midrash teaches that Nadav and Avihu saw the sapphire brick as a replica of the bricks that the Israelites made in Egypt. The brick looked like a beautiful sapphire stone. Why did this brick look so beautiful? This is a brick that the Jews were killing themselves to make. It looked like a beautiful sapphire because Nadav and Avihu felt that they understood the attribute of justice. And they see history the way God sees history. So the brick is sapphire. And that's why in the book of Exodus, when it tells us that Nadav and Avihu, they saw Elohim. Elohim is the name of God that corresponds to his attribute of justice. So Nadav and Avihu saw Elohim, they saw the attribute of justice. And what did they do? They made peace with it, and they were able to eat and to drink. They had no problem with God's justice in the world. Rabbi Kanatopsky suggests that if Ezekiel had seen a brick from Egypt, it would have been made of blood and flesh and tortured bodies. While Nadav and Avihu made peace with the attribute of justice, Ezekiel could never assume the cruelty of understanding. If you feel that you understand why people are suffering, that's cruel. So in the spirit of Ezekiel, when Moses and Aaron see that their service went unanswered, that after all they did, the divine glory did not appear, they pray and they bless the people and they appeal to God's attribute of mercy and loving kindness. Their compassion for the people leads them to bless the people over and over again, to lift the spirits of the people, and to assure them that God's presence will be with them. But Nadav and Avihu assume that the people are not worthy of God's presence. And that's why God's presence has not come. Nadav and Avihu embrace the attribute of justice, and they make peace with it. Perhaps they assume that after the sin of the golden calf, there's no way that God is going to dwell among these people anymore. So all they are able to do, all Nadav and Avihu are able to do, is to offer incense, which was something that might be able to quiet the attribute of justice. But unfortunately, they understood quite well. They understood the attribute of justice, and they fully accepted it. To them, the pain of Israel was like a beautiful sapphire brick. And this bordered on cruelty.